This meeting is being recorded.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. That'll be the last time. And then I'm going to share while you that. Okay. There you go.
All right, so Erik has been kind enough to present today. Erik is a professor of biology at Cal Poly Humboldt in Arcata. He has been conducting research in southwestern Oregon and Northern California for more than 30 years. And some of his past work has focused on western trillium, Port Orford, cedar, serpentine fens, and tree communities of the region. And let's see here. So Erik's talk will focus on two studies. First is a study of how climate change has been impacting the understory plants of our region. And the second will focus on how the dominant conifers are responding to decades of fire suppression and climate change. So with that, we are going to hand it over to Erik. And
can you hear me?
Yep. And we're just going to transfer the screen to you.
All right. Super.
Thanks, Erik.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody for having me. It's nice to be there, at least virtually. We're getting hit with, I think, the same storm you are. We had 2.5 inches since this time last night, and there's more coming. So I'm sort of glad I didn't try to drive up there, but I really wish I was actually there in person. So I am a plant ecologist, and I'm really interested in all things plants. All of my work has basically been done in the Klamath region or the Southern Cascades, and some of those projects were mentioned, but I am going to focus on 2 of my long-term projects tonight, and I'm hoping that I can successfully share my screen with you, and let's see how that goes. Okay, so how does that look? I don't.
It looks perfect, Erik.
Okay, thanks. I couldn't hear a thing. So anyway, okay. So I'm going to focus on 2 projects that I've been working on for quite some time. And let me also know, last thing I'll ask you is, can you see that red laser pointer?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, promise, last question. Okay, well, so the first study is a study that is about trillium, which we all know and love. And it's a project that I have been working on over in the Siskiyous around the Oregon Caves National Monument area for many years. And this is a study that's about the long-term consequences of the industrial clear-cut logging that went on in that part of the world. And the other one is further south in the Russian wilderness, where I've been looking at the conifer communities and how they have changed over the last 50 years. So we're going to start with the one that's up in the Siskiyous about habitat fragmentation. And of course, because you're all botanists, you already know how diverse the Klamath region is in terms of plants. And part of that has to do with the geological diversity. Part of it has to do with the climatic gradients produced by the coast and the elevational gradients, as well as the connections with other landforms on the West Coast. And there are a lot of people who really worked to make this area well known in terms of all the different plant diversity, like T.J. Howe and Lila Leach. But one of the people that I want to focus on is an ecologist that also really helped put the Klamath region in general on the botanical map. And that was a man named Robert Whitaker. Robert Whitaker was a plant ecologist from the East Coast, and he spent his career at the New York Botanic Gardens, and then later in his career, he was at Cornell. And he was they called a quantitative ecologist. He was really interested in trying to make ecology a more rigorous science and collected a lot of data on plants. And one of the many studies he did in North America, he did in the Siskiyous. And it's actually a study that is found in a lot of textbooks. And these two figures here are used to be found in a lot of general ecology college textbooks. And they come from the data he collected in the Siskiyous. On the vertical axis here are feet and meters for elevation. And then the x-axis here is sort of a conglomerate axis that has like wet ravine sites to dry slopes on the right. And what he's trying to do here is show the different forest communities. So over here, these are white fir, and this is white fir with Douglas fir. This is Douglas fir with tan oak. And what came out of this work was that the vegetation of the Klamath is exceptionally complex, which we all know, but this was one of the first times anybody had tried to quantify that. And so a lot of ecologists and botanists paid attention to that. And this is important for the work that I've done, and we're going to see how it becomes important. Well, he collected the data for that study over a couple summers of 1949 to 1951, and he was based in Cave Junction. And some of the work happened over toward the Kalmiopsis on the serpentines, but a lot of it happened over on the east side of the valley in these watersheds that essentially surround the Oregon Caves National Monument, Sucker Creek, Grayback Creek, and Cave Creek. And he produced a huge monograph from this work. So it's a very, very long paper. And in it, there's all kinds of data tables. So these are all different understory species. And the numbers here are binned by elevational bins. And so you can really find a lot of baseline data on the vegetation of those watersheds in this publication. Well, the other interesting thing about his work is it happened right before the age of clear-cut logging that really was sort of a punctuated event in the history of southwestern Oregon. This is a figure that's showing you the cumulative hectares of clear cuts in those watersheds. And so you can see right here, which is when Robert Whitaker was collecting his data, there had been really almost no clear cutting. And then in the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s, that's when almost all of that clear cutting happened on federal lands, and then it just sort of leveled off. So this is basically no clear cutting because this is a cumulative bar here. And that stopped because of the spotted owl injunction. But what all that clear cutting meant was that we went from having these large contiguous forests that were then broken up into these fragments, these islands of unmanaged older forests like this and this that are surrounded by young clear cuts and plantations. And it was here in 1992 when I first came to the Siskiyous specifically to study habitat fragmentation. I came here because there was all this theory in the field of ecology and conservation biology that habitat fragmentation was a threat to biodiversity. But the truth was we didn't really have a lot of data on that. And so I came here because I thought it was a good model study area, and it was. And this is what the landscape looked like in 1992. This is a satellite image here on the left. And what you're looking at is the lighter areas are all clear cuts. All the squiggly white lines are roads. The darker areas are older forests that are left intact. So you can see there are these little islands or remnants in different places. And so what you had was this very rich understory of plants that then got clear cut. And a lot of those plants don't survive out in the clear cut. So it was a very, very different landscape. And if you know that area, this is the boundary of the original Oregon Caves National Monument that was then enlarged, not that long ago, but back in 92, it was just this little area right here. So habitat fragmentation is just something to think about and what that means for all kinds of critters. And of course, the idea is that when you have populations in this contiguous forest here, there are patches of individuals that are well connected to each other. They can interact through pollination and seed dispersal, and they're buffered against sort of external factors like wind and heat and cold. And then as you break up a forest into these little islands, and this is a textbook example from Ohio, you end up with really isolated patches of plants, and we think of them as being at higher risk of extinction because they're smaller patches and they're more isolated from each other. And so I decided to use trillium as a model organism, and that's what I want to tell you about. So when I got there in 1992, the landscape looked a lot like this. You could find patches of older remnant forests. These trees are big. Right here on the left, that red circle is around my pickup truck, which is a small pickup truck, but nonetheless gives you a little bit of a scale. And a lot of plants are kind of isolated in these little moist microsites here, but they're impacted by this open edge quite a bit because a lot of warm air can move in. It gets much hotter out here in the daytime and much colder at night, and all of that air infiltrates into the fragment. So trillium is an interesting species to use for this, and it's worth taking a look at the life history for a second. When trillium seeds germinate, they make a cotyledon the first year that looks like this. They don't look anything like trillium that first year, and you post something like this on iNaturalist, you immediately get dinged by somebody who says that's not trillium, but that can be trillium if you know what you're looking for. After the first year, they just make a single leaf, and they can do that from anywhere from 4 to 7 years, and every fall, of course, the above ground part is dying. And then eventually it'll make 3 leaves. And then eventually, maybe roughly around 15 years, it can do that earlier or later, it becomes reproductive when it has enough energy. And then, of course, they get pollinated, and the seeds are moved by ants as well as yellow jackets. Well, for this particular study, what's important is this underground rhizome, because it's extremely unusual in the plant world. Here's a picture of a rhizome, and what you can see are these stripes. I hope you can see them. I don't know what the projector's like there, but there are these diagonal stripes, and they're leaf scars. And so every year, it lays down a leaf scar. So if you dig this up, and I didn't dig it up entirely. This one I dug up for an example, but normally you leave all the roots intact. You just need to see the top surface. You can age these plants, and that's really, really unusual for an herbaceous plant. So in 1994, I had been out doing fieldwork for 2 years, but I finally started collecting actual data, which turned into my doctoral dissertation at that time. And this is me back in 1994 surveying a patch of trillium. What you're seeing mostly is vanilla leaf. So you can't really see exactly where the trillium are here because they come up a little earlier in the spring. But I'm systematically surveying this patch, counting all the individuals and putting them into stage classes. And by the way, before the talk, I was chatting with some folks here in the Zoom room and realizing that in 1995, just a year after this, I gave a talk to the Native Plant Society on the SOU campus. So that's like 29 years ago. And I had just started this study. So I'm sure I was talking about this, but I probably didn't even have all the data analyzed at that point. So I guess I give a talk every 3 decades there. But So what I did in this study is I had 8 of these populations, and this is just sort of a hypothetical one that's drawn around this area fragment. And here are the 8 populations. They were all in separate fragments, and the fragments differed in their sizes, so I could look at the effect of size. They were different in how far they were from a clear-cut edge. So how far was it from this edge, because I thought that would be important, and how many years since the clear cut. So I knew the dates of all these clear cuts because we have careful records of that. So I just want to jump to what I found instead of like get into all the nitty gritty. But essentially what I found was that populations of trillium that were anywhere near an edge like this had stopped reproducing, whereas populations that were deep in the interior of a forest and were far from any edges were still reproducing. So let's look at this normal reproduction here on the right for a second. And what you see here are the ages of the individuals in the population and then the number of individuals. And so what you can see is there are individuals of all kinds of different ages. Here, the oldest individual is like 58 years old. The oldest one I ever found in this study was 72 years old. And what's important is that the edge that's near this thing, and it would be like out of the screen here below us, pretty far away, had been cut about 23 years before my study. And so everything to the left has been born since the clear cut. And that is telling us that there's plenty of reproduction. Maybe there's some dips here in reproduction, but plenty of new plants are being born in this particular population. Contrast that with this population that's near an edge, and what you have is a clear cut, in this case, that was about 14 years old, and hardly anything has been coming in. No new babies here. There's only 2 individuals that have come in there. And that was true of all the populations that were within about 60 meters of an edge. And the question was why? And that's not exactly the focus of this talk, but I will just say that I spent several years trying to figure out why reproduction had shut down. And I went systematically through a whole list of things like, did they lack pollinators? Did they lack seed dispersers, et cetera? Could they not germinate seeds? And it really came down to 2 possible things. One was that all of the seeds were being eaten by mice near the edge. And that really matched what we knew because my friend was working on a doctoral dissertation on the effect of fragmentation on small mammals, David Tallman, who was then at UC Santa Cruz. And we knew that the mice populations really exploded out in a clear cut right after cutting, and they would forage from the clear cut into the edge, and they'd eat any seeds that you put out. And we did a lot of experimental work with that. And the other thing that probably is going on is that the drying of that edge probably would reduce their survivorship here as well. That's something I couldn't test very well because, well, all the seeds were eaten and there really weren't any individuals to track. So the prediction here that came out of this is that populations of trillium near edges should be declining, and those that are in the interior should be fine. And the question is, well, what actually happened? Well, I did that work back in the 90s. And then I kind of said, well, I'm moving on to other stuff. And I started projects on Darlingtonia. I started projects on Porterford cedar. I was trying to get a job, et cetera. And I kind of left this trillium project behind me. But then in 2005, I thought, I just need to run up there and just count the plants and see what happened to those populations. And so I did that. And then I've decided I'm going to do that every 5 years. And so it's turned into kind of a long-term project. And so this is really the only data figure from this I'm going to show you, but it's worth walking through. Here are the numbers of individuals in those populations in the study I just talked to you about. And if you sum them all up, that's the sum. Then I came back in 2005, and I looked at them, and not much had happened. There was still actually the same number of total individuals. Some of the populations went up, some went down. Then I went back in 2019, and a lot of them had crashed. And there was this big dip. And I was like, well, that could just be random chance. I might have been a bad year, who knows? It could have been some of them didn't come up. And then I went back last summer, just a few months ago, and oh my gosh, there's been this giant decline since 1994, an 86% decline in trillium. And I find that to be really remarkable. But it had nothing to do with who was on the edge. All of the populations did that, even the ones on the interior. So the question was like, should I put any weight in this data? Like, is this actually something that I should be thinking about? Because it's only, well, it was 8 populations and now it's 7 because one of them got clear cut after my study. So I only have 7 populations, very small sample size. And I just wasn't sure if I should even put any weight in it. But there's another study that I realized that I could use to evaluate that, and it was a study using Robert Whittaker's plots. And I'm wondering if some of you even know about this because, well, I'll tell you. So Robert Whittaker collected all that data back in 49 through 51, and then Susan Harrison from Davis and Ellen Damshin, who's now at University of Wisconsin, they decided in the early 2000s that they were going to go back and resample all of Whittaker's plots. And I don't know, I have this feeling maybe Susan has given a talk to your chapter before because she spends a lot of time in Ashland, even though she's on the faculty at UC Davis. And I know I saw Kathy Meckling's name on the Zoom, so I know she knows all about Susan's work. Well, these two folks, they spent a couple years trying to figure out how to do this. And they did this fantastic study, but their analysis was not about individual species. They were looking at how many species were in each plot. And they actually were able to show that there's been a reduction in the diversity of species in the Siskiyous, which is really important. But I asked them, hey, can I borrow the data set for just trillium? And they said, sure. So what we're looking at here is Whittaker's data on trillium. So it's using his original data from the 1960 publication. Down here on the x-axis are these bins of elevation. And so the peak trillium elevation is like 4,500 to 5,500 feet. And that matches what I know about trillium. And over here is this measure of trillium, which is like trillium per plot. It's a density. And Whittaker had like 11 plots at that elevation, 13 here. So the question is, what did they find when they went back, when Susan Harrison and Ellen Damshin went back in 2007? Well, here's what they found. They found almost no trillium at all. There are these little black bars down here. So that's also evidence that something is happening in this watershed, at least to trillium. And I think taken together, I can put a little bit more stock in these two studies side by side and think about why is this happening? And I'm going to pose 2 possibilities to you. I don't think we have an answer to this, but I have a leaning toward what I think is going on. The first thing is just there's been an amazingly dramatic change in the landscape over the last couple of decades. So this is a picture from 1988 of this fragment. It's actually the same one behind my truck over here that's taken from this road. This picture is taken like that. And here it is in 2017. And what you can see is all those clear cuts are not clear cuts anymore. They're forests, they're plantations, and the trees are quite big, right? So, when you're driving these roads now, you don't have views the way you used to have. You could see all the way down to Cave Junction from those roads. You can't anymore. Here's another example of a fragment and now it's sort of surrounded by young forest. So we did some analysis looking at cover change using satellite imagery and trying to understand if the change in cover could be related to how well or how poorly one of our 7 populations were doing. And we couldn't find any relationship there. And I really don't think that there's any evidence that the canopy cover within the plots has changed. I have some data on that, but I can simply tell you that because I know the site so well, and there's only 7 of them, only one of them has had a real significant increase in canopy cover. But all of them, regardless of where they are doing poorly now. So I don't really believe very much in this cover change hypothesis. But I also think something's going on with climate. This is a data set showing you precipitation in the watershed from about when Whitaker did his work up until this is 2019. I haven't extended the data set, so this is my second to last sampling for trillium. And you can see precipitation has been declining, but this is not a statistically significant relationship here. But when you look at things like winter minimum temperature, growing season mean temperature, and growing season maximum temperature, all of those things have increased. It has gotten warmer, both in the summer and the winter. There's probably been reduced snowpack, and there's probably less precipitation. And so when I think about a drying, warming environment, what I think about is this watershed that we're in right here. That's my study watershed and Whitaker's study watershed. And it really has a ridge like this. It's the Grayback Ridge. A lot of you surely know that ridge. And a lot of our moisture is coming off the coast, and it hits that ridge. And it kind of acts like a rain shadow. As you get off onto the other side, the world starts getting drier and drier. And we still have trillium over here, but it becomes more and more restricted to moist sites, north-facing sites, and creeks. And I guess what I'm trying to argue is that I think that this is was good habitat for trillium, and now it's become marginal, and it's kind of reached a tipping point in terms of the climate. And here's what you see when you look at the distribution of trillium. This is the distribution just based on herbarium records. You could use iNaturalist to do the same thing, and I think the data quality is reasonable to do that. But here's our study area. And, it's very much restricted to the coast, and then you get up into the Cascades and then the northern part of the Rockies. But certainly there's a transition to an area that's too arid. And I just kind of wonder if that's what's happening here. I don't have a great way of testing that yet. I have some ideas. We have some other plots out there as well to track trillium. But the end of that story is really that you have this region, and I think it's emblematic of other places in the Klamath that went through this really dramatic 30-year period of clear-cut logging. And those clear cuts are now these sort of species poor plantations. And on top of that, these places are being hit with what's really a double whammy, because now they're getting hotter and drier, maybe slowly, but they are. And one has to wonder about some of the other species we associate with these mesic understory habitats and what their future is. So I'm going to switch gears to the second story of the night, and it's different, although it shares some characteristics. And this is from the Russian wilderness, which is a wilderness area that's quite small, and it's in between the Trinity Alps and the Marble Mountains. And it's a beautiful place. I'm positive many of you in the room have been there. This is part of the wilderness. This is Little Duck Lake and Duck Lake, which is one of the more popular places to go. And the wilderness is pretty diverse. It starts down low in the 4,000-foot area and has really well-developed conifer forests like these, but it also has open areas that are quite rocky. This is above the Little Duck Lake Basin. The area is really well known, and what it's best known for is this thing called the Miracle Mile, which is an approximately 1 square mile that has 18 species of conifers. A lot of people go in there with their list in hand trying to get them all, which I think is a super cool thing to do. But that area was put on the map by these two gentlemen who are who were faculty here at Humboldt State University. And of course, Humboldt State is our old name. Now we're Cal Poly Humboldt. I'm very partial to the old name. John Sawyer was in the biology department and Dale Thornburg was in the forestry department. And they spent their entire careers here at Humboldt State. But back in 1969, they spent the entire summer collecting data in the Russian wilderness. So this is Dale in the front, there's John in the back, and they produced this document, which is a pretty well-known document for the Klamath because it was published in 1974 using the data from 1969. It's called Subalpine and Montane Forests of Granodiorite in the Central Klamath Mountains of California. The reason why it's pretty well known is that it is one of the first times people tried to start naming these complex vegetation types of the Klamath. So it's similar to Whitaker's work. They collected data in a different way, but they were interested in similar things, and they really helped put the Klamath on the map. Well, here are the conifers that they've found. There's this long list of conifers. They've found 17 in that 1 square mile, but they studied the entire wilderness. So don't get me wrong. This study is not just about the Miracle Mile. But a few years ago, somebody found an 18th conifer, the western juniper, that John and Dale had not found. So really cool wilderness area. It wasn't wilderness in 1969, by the way. After John passed away, his wife, who lives here in Arcata and is a friend of mine, was cleaning out John's home office. And she found this crate of data sheets. And she called me up and she asked me if I wanted to look at it. And I was like, sure. You know, John and I did really different work, but we were good friends. He was he was into naming vegetation types, among other things. He was also a really good taxonomist, and those are two things I'm not. So I wasn't really certain I could use this stuff, but she brought it in and we started looking through it. I was looking through it with a couple of my graduate students. And you can see up here, these are data sheets. This says JS for John Sawyer and DF for Dale Thornburg, and there's a date here in July of '69. And all this stuff down here, which looks really messy, is actually pretty carefully taken plant data. And there were hundreds of these sheets in here. And we were not very excited until we found this, which was a map. And this map had all these little red dots on it. And those red dots are labeled with the plot numbers. And we thought, oh, that's just so cool. Let's go back and resample these. And we did. It took a little time for us to get the funding, but we resampled these plots 46 years after John and Dale did. And in the meantime, we found two people who were undergraduate field assistants in 1969. And we contacted them. They are both still alive. And one of them had just retired. He's a bryologist from the University of Maine. And he sent us an entire carousel of slides that he had taken that summer. So we had all of these wonderful slides from 1969 of their field work and their tents. This is John Sawyer over here. And this is Dan Frank, who's one of the undergraduate students working that summer. So the wilderness area itself is interesting because it also has experienced a drying and warming trend. So here's precipitation, winter minimum, season mean, growing season maximum. And so these two are the most striking of these relationships. Plenty of noise in there. The other thing to know is that this is also an area that represents the fire exclusion that has gone on in the Klamath and much of the West over the last century. And it's estimated that the wilderness has missed, depending on what elevation you're at, 2 to 4 fire cycles. So in the last century, the wilderness has not burned. There's been a single fire. It happened in 2014, the White's Fire, and it burned just the sort of western edge of the wilderness, and it only burned one of John and Dale's plots. So all of our plots are unburned. And we resampled 146 plots, and they were 16 meters in radius, and we're recording all of the trees and their cover area. And so I'm going to just jump into the results of what we found. We had enough data to analyze 12 species of conifers. Some of the conifers were just not in enough plots to actually do a statistical analysis, so things like whitebark pine or foxtail pine. And what I'm going to do is just tell you a couple predictions we made, and then we'll look at the data and go from there. So the first prediction was about the shade intolerant pines, things like sugar pine, ponderosa pine. And we predicted they would not have done well. So these are large pines that are usually found historically in open stands. And now in between those large trees, you have all of these other trees filling in with these really dense stands. And so we figured those large pines are not doing well. This, by the way, is John Sawyer in his last trip into the Russian wilderness with Michael Kaufman, who many of you, I guess, would know, who wrote the book Conifer Country. He's a friend of mine. Okay, another prediction we made had to do with the shade tolerant species, in particular white fir. White fir, as many of you know, is very shade tolerant. It comes in under the understory of things like Douglas fir, and it does really well in cool fire-free times. And so we predicted that would increase. But we also knew Shasta red fir, people had been noticing mass mortality events. So we were expecting to see a lot of mortality. And I'm going to come back to subalpine fir in just a second. So what did we find? These are some of our results. You have the total cover on the Y. The older plots are gray. The new plots are green. And statistical significance is indicated with the asterisk. So one of the big changes right away is this huge explosion, if you will, in white fir, which probably matches exactly what's happening like in the Ashland watershed, right? So this is not of any surprise. It went up 31%, and even the number of plots went up from 64 to 84. So that's a really big change in a 46-year period. But the other conifers are all kind of looking badly. And let's take a look at Shasta red fir right here, a reduction of a quarter. And a lot of the mortality we saw Shasta red fir was probably drought induced. So stands that were in high density stands that had probably had warmer winter temperatures. They had a lot of mortality like this, a lot of mistletoe, and a lot of signs of fir engraver beetles and bark beetles. In addition, all of those shade intolerant pines also declined significantly. So sugar pine went down a lot, western white, and ponderosa pine. And those are big drops. So let's move on to two species that are just interesting. Subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce. These are two species that are at the southern edge of their range down in the Klamath. And so these are things, when you think about climate warming, these are those trailing edges where you expect to find things doing poorly. If species, for instance, are going to move northward, it's partly because they're going to start dying at the southern end of their range. So let's take a look at subalpine fir and just look at its range over here in green. And on the West Coast, right, we're at the very, very end of the range. In fact, subalpine fir was not known from California until 1969 when Dale Thornburg found it that summer in the Russians. This map over here, which is Michael Kaufman's map, is showing you those very southern populations down here of subalpine fir, and the ones we're looking at are just right here. The other ones are in the Trinities. And under climate change, you're kind of wondering, are these things going to do okay? And I'll just show you what we found here. Subalpine fir right here, that's a reduction of 40%. So that's quite big. And we also had a reduction of Engelmann spruce, but this was non-significant. So it's certainly nothing like what we saw with subalpine fir. And we'll probably be doing some more work with that. So those are some broad brush results. One of the things that happened to me when we were doing this work is that I set out just thinking we were going to describe how the tree communities changed, and also the understory communities, but we haven't actually gotten to that yet. We just collected that data last summer. But one of the things that I started thinking about that I had not anticipated thinking about was this notion that species might move northward, or in a small area might move up in elevation. So things that are down low in elevation, if under climate warming, they're trying to match their physiological tolerances, might have to move up in elevation to stay at the same temperature. And to be honest, I thought, well, that's kind of out of my realm. We have 46 years of data. That doesn't happen like that. That's too fast. And I was really wrong about that. I dug into the literature, and it turns out there are dozens and dozens and dozens of studies looking at range shifts in elevation over shorter periods of time than I am. So these are just a handful of papers that look at whether or not plants are moving uphill. Some of them are like 40 years. These are 40 years. Some of them are like 20 years and 30 years. So they're not always long. And a lot of these, most of them, show strong evidence that things have been moving up over the last few decades. And that's the last thing I would like to talk about here in terms of our data. So the way people do this is they ask the question, how much did the climate warm in my study area? And how much would you have had to have moved up to match the climate? And every place changes temperature at a different rate, right? So Vermont is going to be really different than here for all kinds of factors, including the fact that it's extraordinarily humid there. So in our region, the increase would require you had moved somewhere between 230 and 333 meters over that 46-year period to keep up with a 1.5 degrees Celsius change in temperature. That's a lot. And people put those on a per decade basis. So you compare your rate to other people's rates. To give you an idea from some of those other studies, this is what people find or have found. These are the rates in meters per decade. And there's a lot of variation here, but like, look, some of these are moving up pretty quickly for a 10-year period. So what did we find? We basically didn't find very much interesting. So I'll just tell you that. Here are all the different species. And down here on the X is what they did in terms of elevational change. Did they go up or did they go down? And what we're looking for are things going up. And all of these things that are in the middle here are not different than zero. That is, they're not statistically significantly different than zero. So they basically didn't move, or we wouldn't conclude they moved. Ponderosa pine moved down, and really it didn't move down. What happened was a lot of the plots at higher elevations, all the ponderosa pine died. So it's sort of an artifact of the data, which is important. White fir, which is that one that had the big explosion, also moved up, most likely because it's shade tolerant and it was able to move into a lot of those sites. And the only one that even did anything remotely cool, if you're looking for upward movement, is incense cedar, right, was somewhere around 60 or 70 meters in total. Well, there's a lot of different ways to look at our data, but on average, things move 11.3 meters up. If you average all those, and that's 2.5 meters per decade. But the basic story is we didn't really see a lot of movement, and that's okay. But it's worth thinking about why we didn't see things move up. And at this point, we don't know the answer to that question, but I think a really likely answer has to do with fire and fire suppression. And what I mean by that is that fire is what affords opportunities for movement. When you have sites like this that are high density forests, this is a very difficult place for a conifer to put a seed, germinate it, and have it survive to reproduction. But fire opens up light gaps and bare mineral soil and places where plants can actually move to. And so it could be that the reason why these communities haven't responded yet to climate warming is because of fire exclusion policies. And it turns out we're not the only ones thinking about that. I thought that was a really cool, novel idea, but it's not. Other people had already thought about it. And here's a paper that just came out within the last year from the Cascades, way up in the North Cascades. And they had sites that had burned and other sites that had not burned. And they had historical vegetation plots. And they show decent evidence that in places where there are fires or were fires, they had a little bit more movement of plants. And in places they didn't have fire, they did not. So that's really the end of the talk. These are two different stories. They're both interesting to me because they're both kind of long-term studies, 30 plus years and 40 plus years. And I think what is interesting about both of them is that I really would not have anticipated I would be talking about climate or climate warming. When I started working in 1992 in the Siskiyous, we weren't all thinking about climate change. I was thinking about habitat fragmentation, and I've been thinking about fire exclusion. And even now that climate warming is so clearly a part of life, I never thought I'd be able to actually measure it in my own plots or anybody else's plots. But I think the reality is these studies show us that we are, and it's going to be increasingly easy to do that kind of work, unfortunately. So I'm going to stop there. I thank you very much for inviting me. It's really an honor, and thank you, Judith Ann, for making that connection.
Thank you so much, Erik. So let's see if we have some questions. Hold on just a sec.
Okay, yeah, I'm seeing the chat.
Yeah.
I'll just go up. Kathy says, what do you count as a proper tree? You probably exclude saplings, but what is a countage? Okay, so actually we didn't exclude saplings. And I'm glad you asked. We collected tree data for seedlings, saplings, and trees. And we did our analysis on all three separately and also by combining them. So yeah, so a seedling in this case is going to be below breast height. A sapling is going to be above breast height, but a small diameter tree, like roughly 3 inches. And so I just showed you the total cover, but if you look at one of the papers we did on this, then it's also divided up into the classes. Wasn't there a fire in the Russians this year? No, not that I know of. There was a fire just close to the Russians, but it was actually in the marbles, and it smoked out the Russians as far as I could tell, because our field crew was there all summer, and they were having a hard time with the smoke. So I'll just say, because that reminds me of this past summer. This summer, we went back to the same plots, which is 9 years after 2014, but or 2015. And we collected the tree data again, but this time we collected all of their understory species, so herbaceous plants as well as shrubs, and we haven't analyzed that data at all. Okay.
I have a couple questions. Yeah. I have a couple of questions, Eric. One, I was wondering if there were any differences now, and now I can't remember. It might have been trillium albidum, but there's a really big population that I'm familiar with that grows under oak trees. And it's in the Little Butte Creek, I think, watershed, so it's probably moister than some of the Rogue Valley, but it's really oak habitat, and it's this massive population. And I'm just wondering, it's low elevation, so it's not going to be as moist probably as what you're talking about. Are there any differences in those kinds of habitats that you've looked at?
Yeah, I know trillium albidum, and definitely I associate it with oak woodlands. And I don't know a huge amount about that species, but although I love it and it smells really good, unlike trillium obatum, which doesn't really smell very much. I think those environments are certainly, they're going to be warming and drying just like the ones I'm talking about. What's happening to them? I have no idea. Yeah, it's a great question.
And then the other thing, kind of clarifying, you were saying that area had missed 2 to 4 fire, did you call it rotations? I can't remember the word you used for it.
Maybe fire cycles, yeah.
So were they doing fire suppression? I think now they're trying not to suppress fire in wilderness areas. Isn't that right? But maybe that's new?
No, I think you're right. It's just that, and that's why the white fire was allowed to burn. So the white fire came up from outside the wilderness, as far as I remember, to the west, and they let it come up, and it came up to the first big ridge, and it just sort of stopped. And so the answer is, I don't think there's really been an ignition in there that really took off, but it is going to happen.
Sure.
There's certainly no question about it. And, it's just going to be the luck of the draw. Are we going to have a nice patchy fire that allows a lot of the canopy trees to survive, or are we going to have decimation?
Right.
And that would be, it's really sad.
And then the final question that I had was about elevation and plants moving up in elevation. I think about this where we are, where we've got a few peaks with unusual plant species, and I just know they're just going to kind of pop off the top into the sky, So I guess that's just how much of that, when you were looking at the species going up, like how much up do they have, some of those species? Is anybody?
Yeah.
And then they move north. They have to.
I get a lot of the papers that I showed you, some of the titles, they all talk about, what's the limit to upward movement. And, but none of those are actually about plants that are running out of territory yet. So we haven't really had a good study of like that. We have a wonderful example of that here in my neck of the woods. It's called the Lasix lupin. And the Lasix lupin, Lupinus constantii, is one of the rarest plants in California. And it is known from a single site. There are 2 little mountain peaks that are within just a couple 100 meters of each other. And there's nowhere to go up at all. It's serpentine. And so people, of course, have been talking about assisted migration, but then, of course, a lot of people are talking about how you should never do that. So who knows?
We had Michael Kaufman, I can't remember, a couple of years back, and he was saying, I think one of the things that I remember him saying was that the foxtail pine was actually expanding, and he was guessing, or whoever was looking at that, was thinking that it was because spaces were opening up because other species were disappearing. Couldn't handle it.
And I have actually seen some data like that for whitebark pine down in the Sierras. And that's really actually not that uncommon. If you get species at lower elevations that are getting stressed because of climate change and they die, they will often allow for some plants to come down where they would have been competing. There aren't a huge number of examples that I know of, but there are some.
And you said that the ponderosa pine had disappeared at higher elevations. Is that what you were saying? That
Yeah, it was just a handful of sites though. So it was a couple plots, and so just imagine if you had like 20 plots in 1969, and the two top ones died in the intervening years, then it would look like it had moved down.
Right. Well, I know I personally have been pretty distressed at how our pines are, we all talk about Douglas fir not being able to take it, but the pines are really being hammered as well. So
absolutely. Yeah. Sugar pine and ponderosa pine. If you ever go into the Russians and you're generally going from low elevation. If you start at the trailheads like the Duck Lake one or the Sugar Creek trailhead, you often don't see it because there's so much dense forest around the trails. But if you look off to the sides at those lower elevations, you can find these old pumpkin pines that are in there. But those are the ones that are dying.
Yeah. Looks like there's one more question in the chat there.
Okay. I have heard thinning treatment is often recommended to increase understory diversity. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how this idea might interact with stressors. Okay. Well, that's a great question. And it is actually something that I'm very interested in. I have a separate study in that watershed where I did trillium work that's totally different set of plots, and it's called a chronosequence study where you have forests of different ages. And that's one of the questions I'm interested in, but we have not thinned those yet. So long story short, I guess my answer to that is that in general, I think thinning is a bad idea in unmanaged forests, at least older unmanaged forests, because my impression in those forests is that they are not being encroached by shade tolerance conifers that rapidly, which is what would be filling in the gaps. I see plenty of light gaps in those forests when I actually walk through them. Where I do think that thinning is a great idea are in the plantations that are in the 40 to 90-year-old age group. So I'll leave it at that. I think those are species poor, species depauperate places, and I think they could use a little structural diversity.
Okay, I was going to mention too, Susan gave us a presentation on that work that she did. So that was great.
Oh, Susan did talk about, that's wonderful.
Yeah,
that's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had a feeling she had talked there.
Oh, you know what we should do? I've got a podcast I've been listening to lately, and he always asks for 3 books at the end of the presentation. And I was thinking, if you can think of a person, and we should do this beforehand, that we should have present.
Oh, well, that's
and you can email us since I'm just off the cuff doing this, but I don't have a pen. So somebody write it down if you have an idea.
Books.
Yeah.
Books are fine too.
Well, I'll mention a couple people really quickly.
Somebody write it down, please. Okay.
So my graduate student who got her master's and now working on a PhD is somebody who did her thesis in that same watershed. So Molly Metok, Metok Smith, and I'll get you her email address. I think she'd give a great talk. And then Matt Riley, who is a Forest Service research ecologist, and he's based in Corvallis, but he's done a tremendous amount of work in the Klamath on fire ecology and understory plant diversity. He's an exceptional biologist.
Terrific. Great. Good. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And we really enjoyed it. It was very interesting and, kind of unhappy, but there we are.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Right.